Today on Gripping Horror, we'll dive into the most terrifying cave diving and diving disasters covered on this channel. From being sliced in half by boat propellers to being lost without air, I present to you the strange and dangerous world of underwater diving. The picturesque French town of Cenote probably seemed a good place to be on the fateful morning of April the 6th, 2005, as Wlodek Szymanowski kitted up, for Cenote is home to some magnificent flooded cave systems, and Wlodek was about to explore one of them, but fate had different plans. This is Wlodek Szymanowski's story. Wlodek Szymanowski is a Polish caver who has long ties to the OUCC, the Oxford University Cave Club. The purpose of the club is to find places that, quite literally, no one has ever been to before, and explore and map new cave passages. The OUCC cavers have been quite successful in exploration in the UK, especially in Wales, and on expeditions overseas. While Wlodek had been an outstanding caver of his generation, it was only in the latter stages of his life that he took up cave diving. In late December 2000, Wlodek set out on one of his regular journeys to the Polish Tatra Mountains to do a spot of winter caving. By the time he returned home, a week or so later, he was a dissatisfied man. Wlodek, now 42 years old, had witnessed a younger generation of cavers going boldly where he had never dared. Fast forward to March 2001, and Wlodek is sitting poolside in Hurghada, Egypt, a resort on the Red Sea coast famous for its diving. Accompanied by a group of his colleagues from the Warsaw office of Siemens Financial Limited, Wlodek had managed to persuade his employer that it would be a good idea if he and his team were to fly off and do a bit of team integration. And where better than at a warm water tourist resort that happens to be a mecca for open water diving. Once there, he enrolled in a diving course and took the first steps towards his goal of becoming a cave diver. He returned home proudly, holding a PADI, Open Water Diver Certificate, dated the 13th of March 2001. In spite of an earlier assurance to his wife that he would not take up cave diving, by June 2001, Wlodek had already consulted with one of Poland's leading cave divers at the time, Victor Bolek, and had bought enough kit to get started, and enrolled himself in a cave diving course. In August 2001, Victor Bolek led a Polish cave diving expedition to a large resurgence, Izbuku Towers, in the Bihor region of Romania, and as a rookie diver, Wlodek went along. But being a rookie did not stop him diving to a depth of 50 meters, or 164 feet. It should be noted that on this expedition the group of Polish cave divers first tested a rebreather unit called the Buddy Inspiration. So, following the expedition, with the zeal of his newfound passion, Wlodek went about getting as much training under his weight belt as possible. On the 4th of April 2005, Wlodek joined a small team organised by another Warsaw cave diver and headed off to the pretty town of Cenote in the Ardèche area of France. This was very much at the tourist end of the spectrum, as the caves of Cenote were already being explored by French divers. Then, on the 5th of April, at around 9 p.m, Wlodek dived for around 80 minutes to a maximum depth of 9.4 meters, or about 30 feet, in what is very likely to have been the Gourde de la Tannerie cave, a deep advanced cave system with a maximum depth of 220 meters, or 722 feet. This dive was recorded on one of his dive computers. The next cave that Wlodek chose to dive in was Gourde de Pont, which is situated just a few hundred meters from the Gourde de la Tannerie. Gourde de Pont is located within the boundaries of Cenote and is to be found under the viaduct of the SNCF railway. This fateful cave is responsible for changing the trajectory of Wlodek's life forever. On April the 6th, 2005, Wlodek arrived at Ardèche and Drôme, the two southernmost areas of the Auvergne-Rhône Alps region in south-central France, featuring rolling hills and low mountain ranges, deep canyons, a Mediterranean climate, and lush green vegetation. The cave he had chosen for that day's dive was the Goule de Pont, a completely flooded cave system that is entered via a 3 to 4 metre diameter walled-off pool situated under an arched railway viaduct. The dive promised to be a good one. Not only was the cave reputed to contain splendid, spacious passages and crystal clear water, but it was also very deep, having already been pushed to 178 metres or 583 feet by French explorers. While Vlodek was not equipped to reach such a depth, this dive was nevertheless an opportunity to see many of the splendid submerged passages and, perhaps, finally to better his personal depth record of 102.7 metres or 336 feet that he'd set some 2 years previously. Deep dives, such as the one Vlodek was preparing to undertake, require a high level of expertise and specialised equipment. By now, Vlodek had acquired both, having been actively cave diving for 4 years and had become one of the leading experts within Poland in what is sometimes referred to as technical diving. For this dive, he would use his much-trusted Buddy Inspiration rebreather equipment and would breathe a specialised gas mixture known as a trimix, formulated specifically for deep diving. The Buddy Inspiration is a computer-controlled technical marvel of sub-aqua engineering that is used as a replacement for the traditional Jacques Cousteau type of scuba equipment. In the right circumstances, a rebreather can allow a diver to stay underwater longer and generally extend a diver's underwater capabilities. As with so many things, this comes at a price, higher initial cost, and higher technical complexity before and during use. It's probably also fair to say that the scope for potential problems is also extended. But all of this techie complexity was just what Vlodek liked. His fascination with gadgets was immeasurable, as was his love of risk-taking. That morning, there had been some minor damp-related problems with his rebreather as a result of residual water from the short dive he'd done the previous evening, but nothing to cause him undue worry or force him to abort the dive. The previous evening's dive also proved that the equipment was functioning correctly, so it was all systems go for the Goule de Pont. He stepped into the entrance pool and attached his 2 10-litre cylinders to his harness, each weighing around 15 kilograms, that had been pre-placed in the water. The cylinders, each equipped with a breathing regulator, were a critical safety backup in case of the rebreather failure underwater. In an emergency, either could be used independently of the rebreather, with one containing trimix, designed for emergency use in the deeper parts of the cave, and the other containing a gas mixture for the shallower depths. After performing the long-winded but necessary pre-dive checks on his rebreather, Vlodek's head dipped below the water and he began his dive. As he descended, Vlodek had many things to keep himself busy, in addition to enjoying the spectacle of the cave passage around him. One of the most important of these tasks was regular and frequent monitoring of the oxygen level of the gas he was breathing. After passing the shingle constriction located 12 meters from the entrance, Vlodek reached a relatively horizontal piece of passage that quickly widens out. The water was, as expected, exceptionally clear that day, and his helmet-mounted lights pierced the darkness with ease, allowing him to see far ahead into the inky distance. Then, at a depth of 18 meters and just 75 meters from the entrance, the cave passage changes direction abruptly and plunges headlong into the depths. This is where the real challenge of the cave begins. For those unfamiliar with diving, following the passage down was not simply a matter of Vlodek rotating his body into a vertical position, with his head pointing down and going for it. A diver, particularly when using the Buddy Inspiration rebreather, needs to maintain a relatively horizontal position in the water. Descent and ascent are normally controlled by regulating the buoyancy of the diver, reduce the buoyancy to descend, and increase the buoyancy to ascend. Thus, Vlodek releases some air from a buoyancy control device attached to his gear and begins to drift gently downwards. The one complication is that as he descends, the water pressure progressively compresses the remaining air in the buoyancy control device, causing an equally progressive loss in its buoyancy, and, if nothing further is done, will lead to an ever faster rate of descent until Vlodek hits the bottom. So, to maintain a controlled rate of descent, he regularly adds new air to the BCD as depth increases. The next 60 meters of depth involve a series of vertical steps in a classic phreatic-shaped passage. The route is lined, and, with the clear conditions that day, finding the guideline would have been no problem. As Vlodek began making his way across the passage, he starts to experience some unexpected problems. First was that the effects of nitrogen narcosis that day probably seemed to be greater than he was expecting, and as he descended beyond 164 feet at this point, the effects became progressively worse. Secondly, he needed to work harder to breathe. The deeper he went, the worse this problem would become. In the midst of the unfortunate circumstances, he simply shifted the problem to one side and convinced himself that he was just having a bad day. Alongside this, his perception of the problem was already dulled by the effects of nitrogen narcosis. For reference, most divers describe nitrogen narcosis as feeling like they're uncontrollably drunk or dazed, which in turn causes poor judgment, a sense of euphoria, reduced muscle function, and disorientation. The deeper Vlodek descends, the more intoxicating the effects become. At a depth of 79 meters, the series of vertical steps ends, and a horizontal gallery is entered. To proceed along the horizontal gallery, he slightly inflates his BCD so as to give himself neutral buoyancy. By this depth, Vlodek's breathing has only become more laboured, accompanied with severe disorientation. Nevertheless, he pushes on along the gallery to the head of the magnificent 30-metre pitch. It is always difficult to be sure of the motivation behind a person's actions, but the decision to press on would have been made in the knowledge that the pitch is a very fine example of its kind, and that its final depth of around 110 metres, or 360 feet, gave him a chance to beat his personal depth record. Vlodek was a strongly self-motivated individual who didn't like to allow minor inconveniences to sidetrack him from his goals. He positively relished adversity and challenge, since they made the final victory even sweeter. Instead of turning back, as he clearly should have done, he continued with the dive, in spite of the difficulties he continued to experience at this point. To descend the pitch, he now needed to vent off a small amount of air from the BCD in order to achieve a slight negative buoyancy. As he slowly descended the pitch, the symptoms he had experienced earlier was worsened immensely with each metre of depth added. The progressively increasing narcosis would have adversely affected both his ability to operate the complex diving equipment he was wearing and his perception of the situation in which he found himself. In addition to the ever-increasing narcosis, the gas he was breathing also became denser and, as a consequence, it would have become increasingly difficult to breathe. Suddenly, in his increasingly narcotic and befuddled state, at a depth of 328 feet, narcosis simply overwhelmed his ability to regulate his buoyancy. Vlodek began descending uncontrollably to the cave floor with immense speed. As he drifted downwards out of control, he came to rest on a ledge at a depth of 345 feet. His rebreather system now damaged from the initial impact. By now, he would have been, at best, in a partially conscious state. The inability to breathe briefly jolted him into action. The rebreather had a modification that allowed him to switch from the main rebreather circuit and breathe directly from one of its small onboard cylinders. The logic was that even if the rebreather had somehow malfunctioned, the onboard cylinder should not be affected by the malfunction. Theoretically, the small cylinder contained enough gas to last him only 60 to 90 seconds, but that should normally be sufficient time for him to get off the rebreather and onto the external emergency cylinder. He turned the switch and would have found that he could once again breathe. Unfortunately, he was by now capable of doing very little else. He lay there, physically and mentally unable to make the relatively simple, but absolutely crucial, move over to his attached emergency cylinder, which remained untouched. Within less than a minute of the switchover to the onboard cylinder, the mouthpiece left his mouth, and he drowned. He was 46 years old. By 3 p.m. he had not returned, and the surface party decided to try to see for themselves if anything could be done, carrying out 2 dives to a maximum depth of 70 meters, or 230 feet, but to no avail. With all reasonable hope gone, the rescue services were alerted for what was by then certain to be a body retrieval. The next day, the French rescue party located Vlodik's body at a depth of 105 meters, close to the bottom of the 30-meter pitch, with the mouthpiece out of his mouth. The island of Cozumel, known as Mexico's crown jewel, is a glistening tropical paradise, famous for its lush greenery, white sandy beaches, and warm blue waters. It is ranked among the world's top diving destinations, attracting thousands of visitors annually. Amongst these was the English pop star and songwriter Kirsty, who, like many celebrities, enjoyed the island for its laid-back atmosphere. In 2000, Kirsty began working with the BBC on an 8-part radio documentary series on Cuban music and culture, as it was very clear from her music that she has a passion for the music scene in Latin America. The series was recorded in Havana, the capital of Cuba, and featured Kirsty interviewing some of the most famous Cuban musicians, including some members of the Bonavista Social Club. Later, in December 2000, after 18 months of non-stop filming, Kirsty needed a long overdue break. Passionate about water sports, she chose Cozumel. This trip, her third, would be especially enjoyable since she planned to introduce her sons, Jamie, 15, and Louis, 13, to scuba diving. It would certainly be a holiday to remember, but in the worst possible way imaginable. Cozumel is an island off the east coast of Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, with its economy based mostly around tourism. One of the main reasons that people visit the Cozumel is to go scuba diving or snorkeling, as it boasts one of the most diverse coral reefs, the second largest in the world, that is home to over 1,000 species. On December the 11th, 2000, Kirsty, her boyfriend, musician James Knight, and 2 sons flew out to Cozumel, Mexico, due to return on December the 20th, just before Christmas. On December the 18th, around 2 p.m., 2 days before they were due to return home, Kirsty and her sons headed out to the Chunganab Reef, a 67,000-acre designated diving area, protected by the National Maritime Park of Cozumel since 1996. The area is extremely popular among tourists, restricted to only access to swimmers, divers, and their dive boats, with a speed limit of 4 knots, which is equivalent to about 4 miles per hour on land. Kirsty's boyfriend, James, chose to spend his day relaxing at their rented villa. Kirsty and her 2 sons head out to a boat called the Scuba Shack, led by an experienced dive master of 30 years, Ivan Diaz. About 300 meters offshore, the group stopped above the reef and began their first dive. All in all, the diving part went rather well. They explore the beautiful marine life the reef has to offer, even going down to the famous 14-foot underwater statues, the Christ, Chacmol, Mayan god of rain, and the Virgin Mary. Certified divers also had the option to be led into a cave, named La Quebrada. This is the only cave you can dive through from the shore in Cozumel. Kirsty had been scuba diving many times before, but neither her and her 2 sons had the experience needed for the cave, so they stuck to the Chunganab Reef. Kirsty's son seemed to enjoy it as much as Kirsty did, although Louis, her younger son, later said that something felt off the entire day, an ominous sense of dread he just could not shake. When the family rose to the surface after completing their 30-minute dive, the dive master Ivan noticed something was amiss. About a quarter of a mile away, heading straight towards them at high speed, was a 31-foot motorboat called the Percolito and showed no signs of stopping. Ivan, in complete shock, thinking to himself that surely the boat's captain would see the divers and swerve to avoid them, or at least try and slow down. He started waving his arms and began yelling for the boat to stop, but there was no one up front looking out. Kirsty turned and noticed the boat heading towards her eldest son, Jamie. It was travelling so fast that its prow was raised high out of the water. There was no way the driver would have seen Jamie in time. Kirsty swam forward and pushed her son out of the boat's path, shouting for him to look out. The boat slammed through the group, hitting the dive master Ivan in the chest and injuring Jamie. There was a loud crack as the boat's propeller hit Kirsty's diving equipment, and the sea began to turn an opaque red with her blood. Ivan then quickly ushered the two boys back on the boat, urging them not to look behind them. The two children saw, however, the worst thing they could possibly see: Kirsty's body floating face down in the water, practically chopped in half by the boat's powerful propellers. Louis recalls, on the first dive, about 2 p.m, we all went down together. There were wonderful things there. I came up to the surface first. Mummy was next to me. I said, "Wow." She smiled and said, "Great." Then she suddenly screamed, "Look out," and tried to push us out of the way. The boat was already over us. I could see the propellers. I was swimming in Mummy's blood. I heard Jamie shout, "Where's Mummy?" I screamed that she'd been hit, and to swim the other way and not look back. The boat, Percolito, did not stop. It drove another 300 feet until it was forced to come to a halt due to the damage sustained when Kirsty's diving equipment bent a metal bar that impeded the propeller's action. The captain of a nearby diver boat called the Nazareno, who witnessed the entire accident and did his best to maneuver his boat into the path of the Percolito, went over to the Percolito and demanded to know why they were on the reef. The captain replied, "I didn't see any boys." Ivan and the two boys were in a state of shock, unable to move and to speak. The captain of the Nazareno, Philip Putt, radioed the port captain, requesting an ambulance, but he knew it would be no use. Kirsty was already dead. Those on the Percolito never made any attempts to help. They stayed around 15 yards away from the scene, watching on the whole time. When the paramedics arrived, the scene was reportedly so gruesome that one of the operators threw up at the sight. Two later autopsy reports, one performed in Mexico and one in London, revealed that Kirsty had practically been sliced in half from the back of her neck all the way down to her waist, with parts of her left leg and chest severed. James, still back at the villa, was called and informed there had been an accident, but little other information was given to him. When he headed down to the Playa Corona, the beach Kirsty's body had been brought onto, still no information had been given to him. It was left to Kirsty's two teenage sons to inform Jamie of the tragic accident. When the police arrived at Playa Corona, they spoke to those on board the Percolito as well as Ivan Diaz. Ivan later recalled the police officers asking those on board the Percolito who was driving the boat, who was in charge of the boat. One man responded, I am the owner of the boat, and was the one who was driving at the time of the accident." This man was 67-year-old Gomea Gonzalez Nova, who was at the time Mexico's 7th richest person. He was the chairman of a company called Controladora Comercial Mexicana, Mexico's second-largest food retailer at the time. Gonzalez Nova had a holiday home in Cozumel for nearly 40 years, so he would have been well aware of the restrictions placed around that area of the reef. On board the boat was Gonzalez Nova, his two sons, his daughter-in-law, his 10-month-old granddaughter, and a 26-year-old boat hand called Jose Sanyam. Police led Gonzalez and his family away for questioning. Within hours of the accident, Gonzalez Nova's lawyer had flown in from Mexico City, and they made sure that the family was first to give their witness statements, leaving many other key witnesses, including Ivan Diaz, waiting for days to give their statements. Felipe Putt, the captain of the Nazareno, later stated that it wasn't until 8 days after the accident that he was asked to come in and give his statement. Despite the fact that he had been a key witness and the man that had called it in, Ivan was questioned for 3 days until his statement was completed, although he later claimed that, initially, police had given him a blank piece of paper and asked him to sign it, saying they would fill in the rest later. Ivan refused, saying he was not going to put his name on a piece of paper before knowing exactly what he was agreeing to. Hours after the accident, and despite the fact that many witnesses overheard Gonzalez Nova claim that he had been the one driving the boat at the time of the accident, someone else came forward to say they were responsible. The boat hand, Jose Sanyam. Sanyam claimed that he was only driving at about 1 knot or approximately 1 mile per hour, but he didn't see any trace of divers or dive boats at the scene, and that he was under the impression that they were not in an area of the Chunkanab Reef, that they were much further out to sea. Not only this, but he claimed that after only 10 minutes had another boat arrived on the scene of the accident. This was a lie, as well as the scuba shack, the boat that Kirsty and her sons had gone out on that day. There were 2 other dive boats in the area, the Nazareno and the Bongulus, both about 160 feet away from the accident. Not only this, but Kirsty would never have taken her 2 children out to the coral reefs that were further out to sea, as it was just too dangerous for beginner divers. The reefs further out to sea are about 3,000 feet deep and are notoriously unsafe for beginner divers, whereas the Cenote Reef is only about 150 feet deep and is a very popular place for newbie divers and tourists. Gonzalez Nova claimed in his statement that they were about 400 meters away from the Cenote Reef when they hit Kirsty, but he also claimed that the Red Cross had removed Kirsty and taken her to a jetty around 400 meters away. In fact, if Kirsty and her family would have been 400 meters away from the Cenote Reef, then the distance from where they were to the jetty would have actually been about 700 meters, as the Cenote Reef is 300 meters from the jetty. To give you a better idea, as can be seen on this map, just how close the designated diving area is to the shore. Therefore, they would have definitely been closer to the shore when they hit Kirsty than they claimed that they were, because Kirsty could not have been that far out to sea if this is the designated diving area. And not only this, but many witnesses contradicted the family's statement that they had only been going at around 1 knot when they hit Kirsty. Those on the nearby boats, Kirsty's sons, as well as locals who witnessed the accident, claimed that the boat was actually travelling at around 20 knots. Had the Percolito actually been driving at 1 knot, then it would have taken 18 whole seconds to go through Kirsty's group, giving them plenty of time to swim out of the way. Despite all the evidence to the contrary, Jose Sanyam was arrested and released on a $9,000 bail and then sent to trial in 2002. The trial did not have a jury, but apparently this is not uncommon in Mexico. The trial also conveniently omitted a lot of crucial evidence that directly contradicted the family statements, and many locals were afraid to come forward due to the power Gonzalez possessed in the area. Sanyam was convicted of culpable homicide and was sentenced to almost 3 years in prison. However, in Mexico, you can pay your way out of your jail sentence if your jail sentence is less than 5 years prison time, by paying 1 peso for every day you would have been imprisoned. So, in March of 2003, he was released from jail after paying $91 to avoid serving the 3-year prison term that had been handed down to him. This is a story of an incredible miscarriage of justice. A Christmas getaway of laughter and joy turned into a tragedy. The case was deliberately fast-tracked and received no publicity in Mexico in order to maintain Cozumel's lucrative tourist industry. McCall's death may have been unjustly swept under the rug, but it would be impossible to do the same to her legacy. In 2001, a bench was placed at the southern entrance of London's Soho Square in memory of Kirsty McCall. In light of the lyrics to her song, Soho Square, "One day I'll be waiting there. No empty bench in Soho Square." 22 kilometers north of Tulum, Mexico. The Sistema Sac-Actun is the world's longest underwater cave system. Sac-Actun lies along the Caribbean coast of Yucatan Peninsula with passages that run to the north and west of Tulum. The Yucatan Peninsula is known for many things, among them its vast number of cenotes. There are, according to some estimates, around 6,000 cenotes just in the Yucatan Peninsula, and more are being found every year. The ancient Maya people commonly used these cenotes as a water supply or for occasional sacrifices because their belief was that cenotes led to the underworld. These natural pits have come to serve a whole different purpose in the 21st century. Many cenotes are now used as diving sites for those who crave the adrenaline of the abyss. But they are not without risks. The Yucatan Peninsula is often referred to as a great Swiss cheese because cenotes have been able to form in such large quantities in this area. This is due to the porous limestone that can be found here. These water-filled caverns were formed in the limestone bedrock when rainwater eroded the surface and seeped into the earth, resulting in natural sinkholes that lead into deep underwater caves, creating what we know as cenotes. Certified divers Kent Hirsch and Michael Nast were cut from the same cloth, passionate and athletic men. Kent, 53, a dentist with a practice in Centerville, was a cyclist and skier who recently took up skydiving. Nast, 36, was an antitrust lawyer with his family's Lancaster-based firm, who enjoyed gardening and loved wine and animals. What brought them together was their shared love for diving. They dove together off the coasts of Florida and New Jersey, exploring shipwrecks and underwater caves. They even had diving nicknames for each other. Hirsch's was Dr. Deco, short for decompression, and Nast's was Caveman. Both Nast and Hirsch were meticulous divers who carefully planned their excursions and took no chances. Michael and Kent had decided that it was time for another one of their great diving escapades, so they planned a trip to Tulum, Mexico, to go diving as part of a larger group of 9 divers, including a guide. The group had been diving together for a number of days, exploring the beautiful wonders of the peninsula, until one fatal cenote. This is the story of the Cenote's Kalimba disaster. On the morning of Tuesday, December the 9th, 2004, the group travelled to Cenote's Kalimba on the Koba Road. They had done a traverse dive of the cave system a day earlier, so the group was fairly familiar with the cave and very excited to continue their exploration of Sak Aktun. Cenote's Kalimba is not particularly the deepest underwater cave, but that does not make the dive easy. Personnel working at the dive site described Cenote's Kalimba for experts only. It is a small, difficult to navigate cave with very fragile and confined spaces. Shortly after arriving, the group split into 2 teams. One team of 5, which included the guide, and one team of 4, which included Kent, Michael, Jane Downey, and William Downey. Both teams planned to enter and then exit the cave system at Cenote's Kalimba. Led by the guide, the team of 5 descended first, following the main Kalimba guideline to its end, where they would encounter a snap and gap. The snap and gap is a piece of line of approximately 20 feet in length that attaches to the end of the Kalimba guideline to the Paso de la Gato guideline to create a continuous guideline. Typically, if not in use, the snap and gap is rolled up and placed at the end of the Kalimba line. After reaching the snap and gap, Team 1 installed a PNDM labelled number 1 on the snap and gap line to show any other teams in the cave that this line was being used and to mark their exit at this intersection. After successfully making it past the snap and gap, Team 1 continued downstream, following the Paso de la Gato line for 65 feet until the guideline makes a hard right turn. In this section, a white arrow marks a short jump to a permanent guideline on the left that leads to Cenote's box chen. Team 1 installed a jump spool the distance of approximately 6 feet to connect the 2 lines. The white arrow also points downstream towards Grand Cenotes, away from the direction of their intended exit. To counter this, Team 1 installed PNDM number 2 on the exit side. This would get rid of any confusion, showing both teams' intended exit back towards the snap and gap and the Kalimba line. One last cookie was placed on the jump spool line, close to the spool end. On exit, if PNDM cookie number 3 had been removed, the remaining team were to take up the spool that was connecting the Paso de la Gato line and the box chen guideline. Team 1 would then follow the permanent box chen guideline for approximately 500 feet, installing an additional spool to make a 5-foot jump to the left that closes the gap on the box chen line and continue on the circuit in a clockwise direction until reaching Cenote's box chen. Michael, Kent, Jane and William were to descend shortly after Team 1, allowing them a head start to install the reels and PNDMs. The plan for Team 2 was to follow Team 1 to the box chen line using the spools and PNDMs installed by Team 1. As mentioned earlier, Team 1 installed a spool that closes the jump on the box chen line before continuing in a clockwise direction. Team 2 would bypass the jump installed and continue in an anti-clockwise direction following the line towards Cenote's box chen until they hit thirds. Unlike Team 1, Team 2 was expected to turn the dive before reaching box chen, based on air consumption rates. Michael, Kent, Jane and William were expected to be exiting ahead of Team 1 as they would have turned their dive earlier. It should be noted that one member of Team 2 had a digital camera in an underwater housing equipped with strobes and was planning on taking photographs during the dive. Team 1 completed their dive to Cenote's box chen, where they surfaced for approximately 2 minutes and then returned the way they had come, removing the box chen circuit spool and the spool connecting the permanent box chen line to the Paso de Legato line, along with PNDM cookies number 2 and number 1. As mentioned earlier, Team 2 was supposed to turn their dive before reaching Cenote's box chen, so the assumption was that Team 2 had already exited ahead of them. Also, PNDM cookie number 3 was no longer in place, and based on their protocol, on exit if PNDM cookie number 3 is no longer in place, the remaining team should take up the spool. Team 1 reached the surface at Cenote's Kalimba after a 99-minute dive, having entered the water at approximately 9 a.m, exiting at 11:10 a.m. with a maximum depth of 44 feet. At no time during the dive had the two teams encountered one another. Upon reaching the parking area, the guide became concerned that Team 2 were not there as expected. Panicked, the guide then drove in one of the group's vehicles to the Grand Cenote's entrance, thinking that the lost members of the group may have exited there. Not finding them at Grand Cenote's, the guide rushed back to Kalimba, where Jane and William would just barely surface, sharing air with approximately 500 psi left in one set of doubles. As composed as they could be in the situation, Jane and William informed the guide that Kent and Michael were still in the cave. His stomach sunk. At this point, the guide and two of the other members of Team 1 got back into the water and headed back downstream along the permanent Kalimba. As they reach the 250-foot mark from the entrance, they spot Kent and Michael with their second stages out of their mouth, facing towards the exit of Kalimba. Both Kent and Michael had zero pressure in their tanks. Kent's primary light was still burning. Michael was floating at the top of the cave ceiling, with his long hose deployed. His primary light was off and stowed. His backup light was turned on and laying on the cave floor below him. One of the divers from Group 1 was able to recover Kent on his own, leaving the guide and the other diver to recover Michael's body, which would prove difficult due to the small and restrictive nature of the cave passage and his tangled long hose that had been deployed. The local authorities took possession of Michael's and Kent's bodies upon recovery to the surface and interviewed the guide and all the members of the group at the Ministero Público in Tulum. Now, let's take a look into what went wrong. Team 2 began their dive at Cenote's Kalimba shortly after Team 1. They reached the snap and gap at the end of the Kalimba line in approximately 32 minutes, having travelled through very small caves with multiple minor restrictions. At the snap and gap, they turned left, following the permanent Paso de Legato line downstream for approximately 65 feet to the jump to the box chen line. They turned left at this intersection and followed the jump spool over to the box chen line and continued along this line until the dive was called by one of the team members upon reaching thirds. The team turned around and swam back to the spool closing the 6-foot jump from the box chen line to the Paso de Legato line. At this intersection, the last person in the Team 2 removed PNDM number 3, but left in place the jump spool and the PNDM number 2, marking the exit back to Kalimba. The team of 4 all turned left at this intersection rather than right and back to their exit as indicated by PNDM number 2. Team 2 then swam following the permanent Paso de Legato line downstream for 25 minutes and a distance of approximately 1,400 feet. Throughout this time, the team member with the camera reportedly continued to take photos. The team would have swum past 4 key directional arrows, all pointing downstream towards Grand Cenotes. That clearly signifies that the line is not heading toward their intended exit at Cenotes Calimba. At its end, the permanent Paso de Legato line is separated from the permanent Grand Cenotes traverse line by a distance of approximately 70 feet of darkness. At this point, Team 2 finally realized they had made a very grave mistake. One member of the team deployed a safety spool and began a search for the line or exit. The other 3 members of Team 2 remained on the Paso de Legato line during the search. Unfortunately, the search was unsuccessful and the dive team turned around and swam back to the Paso de Legato guideline. At some point during the return swim, the dive team of 4 became separated into 2 buddy pairs. It is not known exactly how far apart the 2 buddy teams were. However, Jane and William, who survived, stated that they could see the lights of Kent and Michael behind them. Jane and William began sharing air at some point on the Calimba line and just made it back to the surface in time. Nast and Kent also began sharing their air, inching and inching closer to the exit, both determined to survive, but unfortunately failed to make it all the way back to the Cenotes Calimba in time, drowning approximately 250 feet short of the exit with no air left. Jane and William had a total bottom time of 129 minutes when they were found. Michael and Nast had 148 minutes of total bottom time, giving a difference of only 12 minutes, during which they had drowned. As seen countless times, one mistake is the difference between life and death when it comes to cave diving. In this case, disorientation and confusion led Michael, Kent, Jane, and William to become lost and unable to find their way back out of the cave. Jane and William got lucky, but unfortunately, it was not Michael and Kent's day. Rest in peace to Kent Hirsch and Michael Nast, 2 passionate men who died doing what they loved the most. Their memory will forever live on. The world of cave diving poses an unusual and unique set of risks, but like any extreme sport, such risk can be managed with the right plan and experience. If there is a disunion of either one of those mentioned factors, your dive of bliss and joy can become your hell on earth in the blink of an eye. This is the story of Gary John McElliott and the deep Ecton mine. Visitors to the beautiful and tranquil Upper Manifeld Valley today would scarcely believe that the green and verdant hillsides of Ecton were once the scene of industrial activity on a scale like no other, both above and below ground. On Ecton Hill, Staffordshire, England, lay a group of mines, unusual for the Peak District. The mines produce predominantly copper rather than lead and zinc. The names of the mines are as follows: Deep Ecton Mine, Deep Shaft, Clayton, Dutchman, Bag Mine, Chadwick, and Waterbank. The most impressive being the Deep Ecton Mine, known for its extremely deep shafts. The Deep Ecton Mine has been mined since the Bronze Age, and in the 18th century was a major producer of copper and the deepest mine in Britain. Ore-bearing rock would have been extracted, with men being paid in a percentage of the value of the ore. Women and children worked on the dressing floors. Women used hammers to break up the ore into small pieces, and boys then barrowed the ore to a shed, where young girls sorted it into 3 different grades. It was then beaten down further into finer grades, then taken to the bundles, large artificial ponds, where it was mixed with water and poured down a sloping surface to separate out the denser ores from the rock residues. Ecton at times produced ore up to 60% purity, and copper was extracted for a wide range of uses, including the manufacture of brass and the sealing against barnacles of Royal Navy vessels. Egton Hills is a Site of Special Scientific Interest, SSSI, and the Egton mine itself is an underground SSSI. The geology and mineralization of the area is characterized by complex folding and faulting of the limestone. Exposures of this, both on surface and underground, represent a valuable study resource. As well, the rock exposures at nearby Apes Tor provide opportunities for the study of geological structures, which can then be seen again underground, for example, in Salt's Level. Some of the earliest technological developments were a steam engine developed by Bolton and Watt, which would have pumped water and moved men and ore around the caverns. As the mining became deeper, to follow the ore, the need to pump water out of the mine became ever greater. To combat this, an underground water pumping engine housed within a vast man-made cavern was built in 1783. The deep Egton pipe was eventually worked to a depth of 1,090 feet below the ridge top. By then, something more powerful was required to wind the ore up from the depths. Thus, in 1788, a steam-powered winding engine of the latest type built by Bolton and Watt from Birmingham was installed in an engine house at the top of the main shaft. Mining below river level ceased in the 1850s. The mine was allowed to flood, and all production stopped in the 1890s. During this time, fortunes were made and lost. Let's fast forward to the 20th century. On the 10th of March, 1963, Gary John McElliott and a group of cavers arrived at Egton Hills. They parked at the roadside beyond the ruins of an old building thought to be associated with the railway and began the ascent up the hill. Along the adit to this mine are some deep flooded shafts, which the party planned on exploring. The word adit is from the Latin aditos, meaning entrance to the mine. They enter through the adit and follow a long passageway that was, in places, flooded to their knees. This made walking quite challenging and tiring. It should be noted that Gary and the rest of the cavers were diving with a local branch of the BSAC, the British Sub-Aqua Club. The club was founded in 1953 and at its peak in the mid-1990s had over 50,000 members. It is a diver training organisation that operates its associated network of around 1,100 local, independent diving clubs and around 400 diving schools worldwide. After exploring the maze of tunnels, chambers and canals the mine had to offer, around lunchtime, deep in the heart of the hill, the group reached the head of the main shaft located at the centre of the mine. This specific 1,000-foot deep flooded shaft piqued Gary's interest. Gary heard that at about 100 feet down one of these shafts, there was believed to be a side passage. In his excitement, he borrowed a twin-set air tank, which had already been used that afternoon by the group. At 100 feet, this air would only last Gary 10 minutes. This act was optimistic, but since Gary was an experienced diver, they thought nothing of it. The team set up a signalling system for Gary. It goes as follows: 1 pull on the line, alert, 2 pulls, pay out more of the guideline, 3 pulls, take in the guideline, 4 pulls, pull me up, and lastly 6 pulls, meant he was about to enter the side passage. This, different from the standard's BSAC code, which then, as now was, 1 pull, alert, 2 pulls, stop, 3 pulls, go further from base, 4 pulls, return to base, and 6 or more pulls signified alarm. With the system in place, Gary began his descent into the bottomless tunnel. He swam 100 feet down and peered around for the side passage. Not finding it, Gary realized that the side passage must be further down than what was thought. So, he kept on going down until he reached a depth of around 260 feet. Alas, finally spotting the entrance to the passage, he gave 6 pulls to signify that he was now entering the side passage. He gave 2 more pulls and was given a total of 240 foot of line before continuing down the passage. At this point, Gary had already spent multiple minutes on the dive, and as stated earlier, at 100 feet, the air in his tank would only last for about 10 minutes at this depth. But since Gary kept swimming down to find the side passage, his air consumption rates continued increasing, resulting in more air being used. Something Gary had not paid attention to. Gary gave 2 more pulls and continued swimming down the tunnel, hoping to see where it led to. At this depth, the effects of nitrogen narcosis would have now become more apparent in his behavior. Gary, totally disorientated and confused, didn't realize the severity of the situation, his air supply that was running crucially low. The group began to worry when Gary failed to respond to signals, but as said before, Gary was experienced, so they thought nothing much of it. As 10 minutes passed, the group began to seriously worry now. Gary had not signaled any signs of life for quite some time. Devastated, they concluded that something went seriously wrong and began planning for a recovery of his body. As a different pair of divers from the BSAC began the descent into the tunnel, Gary's body was spotted floating to the surface. His gag was not in his mouth, his weight belt was missing, and his bottles were completely empty. Upon the body being recovered to the surface, at post-mortem, Gary's death was found to be caused by anoxia. Anoxia occurs when your body or brain completely loses its oxygen supply. Gary had not allowed a sufficient air margin for the dive, along with the effects of nitrogen narcosis significantly impairing his judgment, which caused him to swim further and further down the side passage in search of its end. By the time he realized he ran out of air, he was just coherent enough to remove his weight belt in a last-ditch effort to ascend to the top, but unfortunately, it was too late. This is a story of a horrible tragedy that could have been easily prevented. It's easy to say that what Gary should have done was locate the side passage, then head back to the entrance of the shaft to get more air before exploring the passage. But in an environment as extreme as cave diving, thinking can be easily swayed, and unfortunately, Gary's life had to be the example. We'll dive into a story about a very experienced and responsible diver, known among his friends for his exceptional meticulousness. But, as seen many times before in cave diving, experience does not equate to flawlessness. This is James Edward Miller's story. Colonel James Edward Miller was born on the 23rd of October, 1960. Straight from childhood, James was an overachiever, the habit that stuck with him all through his adult life. James attended and graduated from Arkansas Technical University in Russellville, Arkansas, where he earned a bachelor's degree in computer science. Following his time at university, James enlisted in the U.S. Army and U.S. Army Reserves, where he served for 31 years, attaining the rank of colonel. Most notably, James served in Operation Desert Storm during his military career. You must be wondering what life looked like for James away from all the action. Well, in his free time, he was an avid cave diver and outdoorsman. He eventually became a well-respected member of the cave diving community, joining the WKPP as a support diver in 2002. The Woodville Karst Plain Project is a project and organization that maps the underwater cave systems underlying the Woodville Karst Plain. Truly the Beethoven of diving organizations, WKPP divers hold every deep distance record in underwater caving. The Woodville Karst Plain Project is also responsible for exploring and mapping more cave passageways below 190 feet than any other organization in the world. As time passed, James, formerly a support diver, became a senior team explorer for WKPP, doing serious setup and exploration dives. Years went by, and James continued to do what he loved, exploring and mapping unknown underwater cave systems, until one fateful exploration. On Saturday, June the 11th, 2011, James and the Woodville Karst Plain dive team arrived at Whiskey Still Sink, located on a private property at 127 River Sink Road. By now, James was considered an expert diver with more than 20 years of dive experience accumulated. James and the WKPP dive team had been working for many months, exploring and mapping caves in the Crawfordville region. Diving a series of sinkholes and caves that connect to the Wukula Springs. Up next in the dive plan was an underwater cave called Whiskey's Steel Sink. Unfortunately, neither James nor the dive team could have possibly been prepared for the horrors that were about to unfold here, especially since James had already dived in Whiskey's Steel Sink many times before without problem. Not to mention, he completed a 12,000-foot setup in Wukula only a few weeks prior. Whiskey's Steel Sink is located in a coastal woodland of the Warner Boyce State Park in Pasco County, Florida. The spring pool is situated about 200 yards north of the entrance to a dirt road heading north of Salt Springs Road, behind the Gull View Square Mall. Admittedly, many divers know about Whiskey Spring, but have not explored it. Firstly, due to its remote location on private land, and secondly, WKPP is the only organisation currently allowed to dive Whiskey Spring due to the extreme nature of the system and the discipline required to safely explore it. This is a controversial issue, as many people think Whiskey Spring should be open to the public, or at the least, to other qualified cave diving groups and individuals. Peering down into the 164-foot deep shaft of brownish black liquid, with James in the lead along with two buddy divers following, they begin the descent into Whiskey Sink at 2 p.m. From Whiskey Sink, the conduit proceeds at a shallow depth to Innisfree Sink. Then, beyond Innisfree, it drops deeper to a maximum depth of around 225 feet, or 69 meters, and continues down. Thus, their decompression stops were to be done on the other side of Innisfree. A decompression stop is a pause in a diver's ascent, made to allow the body to expel dissolved gases, primarily nitrogen in the blood, that was absorbed by the diver during the dive. Without decompression stops, these gases would expand, turning into bubbles, causing decompression sickness. The spinal cord and brain are usually affected, causing numbness, paralysis, impaired coordination, and in the worst cases, death. While recreational divers must be aware of their ascent rate and perform multiple safety stops, for deep divers such as James and the two buddy divers, keeping a slow ascent rate is often not enough to avoid problems. The solution? Stage decompression. Stage decompression is a special type of ascent where a diver stops at various depths for certain amounts of time, breathing stage bottles of different gas blends at each stop point. This accelerates inert gas diffusion and expels the gas out of the diver's body faster. The team's bottom mix was gas blend meant for a depth of 240 feet. They carried along with them decompression gas to be used at 120 feet, 70 feet, and oxygen at 20 feet depth respectively. Given the offset profile of the stops, it is concluded that the team came up with their own decompression setup. Decompression must start downstream of Innisfree, as the Innisfree Sink becomes shallow before heading back upstream to Whiskey Steel Sink. James and the two buddy divers begin making their way towards the shallow cave between Whiskey Sink and Innisfree in Ashy. The team currently using their 120 feet bottles, which was suitable for the shallow depths. As the team continued passing Innisfree, they dropped decompression bottles at their respective depths, 20 feet, 70 feet, 120 feet, and 240 feet. The first fatal error occurred at the 70-foot stop. James dropped one of his 240 feet bottles at this stop, a tank that was needed to survive the deeper sections of the cave. Instead, he should have dropped his 70 bottle, as it should never have been carried any further into the cave. James was the last one to leave the 70 feet stop. As none of them noticed, the team continued proceeding down to the 120 feet stop. The team stopped for their switch to the 240 feet gas mixture, which was their bottom gas, as they were now proceeding into the deeper parts of the cave. At this point, the second and most crucial error occurred. James switched onto his 70-foot bottle, breathing the completely wrong mix of gases for the current depth. Part of the WKPP standard procedure, and a very critical step in each and every bottle switch, is to check the MOD sticker on the side of the bottle, which would have made it very clear that he was about to switch to the wrong bottle. But for some reason, this check was missed. To make matters worse, the secondary check was also missed. The buddy divers were to watch the bottle switches carefully enough to confirm the correct bottle is in play, but once again, this secondary check was not performed, and the error was not caught. So, following the switch, the team dropped their 120 feet bottles and continue on into the cave. A little less than an hour went by. The whole time, James continued to breathe the wrong gas mixture. Shortly after reaching 240 feet, the team turned their dive and began their ascent. With James in the lead, they start swimming back upstream to Innisfree, the group still completely unaware of the horrors that were about to follow. Then, without warning at 222 feet, James began seizing uncontrollably. Complete terror was unleashed. His buddy divers, now in complete shock, sprung into action, swimming over to James, but unfortunately, the divers were unable to get an oxygen tank of the correct mix into him in time. They tried shaking James out of his incoherent state, but were unsuccessful in their attempts, and James drowned in their arms. After a prolonged exit, the team was able to bring James back to the basin at Innisfree, and shortly thereafter, a pair of WKPP support divers from another cave dive site in the Natural Bridge area of Woodville brought him back to the surface. The support divers estimated that James was in the water approximately 1 hour and 40 minutes. James was pronounced dead at 4:25 p.m. This is a tragic story of a series of unfortunate events that lead to an irreversible ending. There was a significant error, a critical error, plus missed opportunities to catch and correct those errors. James was a very experienced and responsible diver, known among his friends for his exceptional meticulousness. The caving community thought he'd be one of the last people ever imagined to die this way. This dive was well within his skill and experience levels, and the site was very familiar to him. But for some reason, on this day, his usual attention to detail and by-the-book orientated nature was negatively affected. Circumstances that would prove fatal. This would not be the first time that a highly trained US military soldier make a small mistake underwater, which would prove fatal. About 11 years prior to James Miller's accident, on the morning of September the 17th, 2000, Air Force Master Sergeant Paul Hayden and his brother start walking into the old horizontal water well, a long mile up remote, little-known Goss Canyon, in La Crescenta next to the Angeles National Forest. Paul had grown up in La Crescenta and had gone into the old well, opened in 1907, many times before. He was now a skilled US Air Force Pararescue instructor. On this trip, he intended to go farther than ever before by passing sumps hundreds of feet deep in the old well. About 150 feet in, they encountered water. Hayden anchored a rope at the edge of the water for use as a guideline and prepared to begin his dive. His primary light was a waterproof video camera lamp. He had told his brother that he had 2 hours of air and to get help if he did not return within that time. However, about 20 minutes later, something went terribly wrong, and his brother could no longer move the line. When he did not respond to tugs on the rope, his brother went for help, calling authorities at about 1:20 p.m. He hurried to the nearby La Crescenta Sheriff's Office for assistance. Soon, rescue personnel from several agencies using four-wheel drive vehicles to traverse the old, treacherous dirt road arrived outside the well entrance. About 185 feet into the flooded section, and over 400 feet from the entrance, Rescue diver Mark Lonsdale found Sergeant Paul's body in a long, partially water-filled passage. His head was underwater, and the regulator was out of his mouth. His scuba tanks were nearly full. Paul's body was recovered from a 1-meter diameter tunnel immediately below a gas pocket. A videotape recovered from his camera indicated that Paul had poked his head into the gas pocket and removed his regulator from his mouth. The camera then recorded a fall to the bottom and no further movement. Mines and wells are inherently more dangerous than caves, since there is much more likelihood of collapse and the possible presence of toxic gases and low oxygen levels. Subsequent samples from the airspace showed only 4% oxygen. Normal air contains 21% oxygen. Breathing air with 7% or less oxygen will cause the required oxygen supply to the brain to be immediately shut off, a condition known as asphyxia, a condition Paul succumbed to. What makes this story even more unfortunate is that prior to the trip, Paul had agreed with his Pararescue co-workers that he should not remove his regulator, a small mistake he made with fatal results. If you've made it this far, I just want to say thank you for watching. If you're new here, welcome to Gripping Horror, a storytelling channel about all things horror. Looking forward to seeing you all in the next one.